Hello, and welcome to my personal view of Alaska. In August of 2008, I was very fortunate in being able to take a trip to the southern part of Alaska, sometimes referred to as the Inside Passage. And during my trip, I visited Gustavus, Haines, Skagway, and Juneau. In case you are not aware, Alaska is the largest state in the United States, landmass-wise, and has the fewest inhabitants per square mile of just over one person per square mile. In order to get to Alaska, I flew to a small island called Gustavus. It is a sparsely inhabited island with two main roads. One is either on the road or on the other road, as they say in Gustavus. In Gustavus, I stayed in a bed and breakfast aptly named the Gustavus Inn. My first full day in Gustavus, I went kayaking with the whales. You can see our group getting ready for our adventure at the inn. We were putting on our wetsuits. The van then took us to the pier, pulling the kayaks behind it. At the top of the pier, we had to walk down a long plank to the dock where our boat was waiting to take us to an uninhabited island in the mouth of Glacier Bay. As you can see, it was a very gray day when we left the pier. I was sure we were going to get rain, but what the heck, we had our wetsuits. About 15 minutes out, we were welcomed by some otters. Once on the island, we were offloaded with the kayaks, given some additional instructions, and got into our kayaks. From the island, we began our kayaking tour about 50 yards off the shore. During our travels, we saw whales, more otters, as well as sea lions. As the day progressed, the sun came out. It was probably the nicest day weather-wise during the entire trip I was in Alaska. As you can see, not too far from our kayaks were some whales visiting a passing boat. Needless to say, our kayaking trip was just amazing. After returning to the inn and having a wonderful dinner prepared by a chef brought in by the inn's owner just for the tourist season, we ventured to a local beach where we found a bald eagle hanging out on a pier. After it flew away, an incredible rainbow appeared. It had to be the most beautiful rainbow I have ever seen. We were then provided with a stunning sunset over the distant snow-capped mountains to end our first full day in Alaska. The next morning, we got up to take a boat excursion up Glacier Bay to see the Johns Hopkins Glacier. As we cruised up Glacier Bay, I was amazed at the vastness of the wilderness of Alaska. It is how I pictured the rest of the United States before the settlers arrived in the New World. We saw wildlife everywhere we looked, from sea lions hanging out on the rocks to bears walking along the shoreline, to mountain goats traversing sheer rock faces, to puffins waddling around. As we got closer to the Johns Hopkins Glacier, we saw our first small glacier. I was not only struck by its mass, but also by its turquoise color. I had always thought of glaciers as being white ice, not blue. The closer we got to the glaciers, the colder it got. I was so glad I had my long underwear on, even if it was August. The ice was floating in the water as we crept closer to the great Johns Hopkins Glacier. Our boat crisscrossed the waters to avoid hitting any ice floes head-on. Upon my first view of the Johns Hopkins Glacier, it was shocking. I could not believe how massive it was, and of course how brilliantly blue its turquoise-colored ice was. As we got closer, I heard a loud noise. A big chunk of the glacier fell off into Glacier Bay. This is known as calving. As we left the great glacier, I was so full of awe having witnessed such a magnificent example of nature. Our last day in Gustavus, we decided to change our plans, and instead of leaving for our next destination in the morning, we pushed out our departure time to the afternoon so we could go whale watching. We left out again from the same pier we had left from 2 days prior when we went kayaking. Again, we were headed for the mouth of Glacier Bay, the same place where we had kayaked. Only this time we would stay on the boat to view whales, hopefully up close. The morning was gray and overcast, and stayed that way the entire time we were out. Off in the distance we could see whales breaching through the cold Alaskan waters. Each time a whale would appear, the participants on the boat would ooh and ah as though they were watching fireworks on the 4th of July. It got quiet after a while, as there were no more whales breaching. So our captain moved the boat to a new location, not far from where we had previously stopped. Shortly thereafter, off in the distance, we could see a whale breach, and then another, and then another. The whales kept getting closer to our boat as they continued to pop up through the waters, sometimes coming down with such a mighty splash. I was so enthralled by what I was witnessing, trying to take as many pictures as fast as I could, that I really didn't notice how close the whales had actually come to the boat. At one time, I was actually looking directly in the eye of one of the whales. I felt as though the whales knew they were giving us a show as they circled around the boat and continued the show on the opposite side of the boat as they swam off into the distance toward the snow-capped mountains so tall that the clouds covered their tops. We returned to shore and then went to the airport to catch our single-engine plane to take us to our next destination, Haines. It was still overcast as our plane took off, gliding over the treetops, then over a large river heading directly toward an ice-filled river. The plane followed the ice-filled river up to the top of the snow-capped mountains, the ones we had not been able to see the tops of earlier that day during our whale-watching trip. The pilot flew us between the rocky mountaintops over a pass cut into the mountains over the centuries as though we were following a highway of ice below us. When we finally flew out of the mountains, we arrived at our next destination, Haines. I was somewhat sorry to leave the beauty of the snow-covered mountaintops, as they were so incredible, high above the clouds. Our motel in Haines had a beautiful view of the river where cruise ships sometimes dock. We explored the town and found a huge totem pole with its intricately carved characters. The next day, we took a rafting tour down the Schuylkill River. The river is fed by melting snowpack of the surrounding mountains. The river is known for being a bald eagle migration point, where every year, for some unknown reasons, bald eagles show up to congregate for a week or so, and then most of them leave. The local eagles, however, remain behind, which we were able to spot as we cruised down the river. When we finished our cruise, we headed back to town. The tour bus then unexpectedly pulled off to the opposite side of the road. Our guide then directed us to get off the bus and go back across the road to a small stream. There we were able to witness salmon spawning. What was so incredible to me was to learn that the salmon leave the freshwater rivers after they are hatched and go out to the saltwater oceans to grow up. While in the salt water, the salmon's gills adapt to the salt water. Then, when the salmon instinctively know it's time to spawn, they head back to their freshwater birthplace. However, their gills do not revert back to handle fresh water, and thus they are unable to eat during their journey back home. By the time the salmon get back to their exact place where they were hatched, they are almost dead from exhaustion. The fish fight their way back upstream to lay and fertilize their eggs before dying. Unfortunately for the salmon, bears instinctively know when they are returning to the local waters and are waiting for the fish to return. The salmon is high in fat and high in protein that bears need to load up on before they hibernate in the upcoming fall. When we got back to the bus and headed back into Haines, we then rented a car and drove out to a large lake that was surrounded by trees and mountains. It was a breathtaking vista that was so picturesque. We were even able to see more eagles there.